Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome investigative journalist Jean Guerrerro on her latest book, Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. Jean, welcome to the program.
Hi, Sam. Great to be here.
So, all right. I want to start. You spend a significant amount of time, maybe the bulk of your, I don't know the bulk, but the real emphasis on sort of Stephen Miller's development into the person that he is today. I want to just go backwards a little bit so that people get a sense of like where that ends up. So,
Sure.
because you, I know that you were reporting on the family separation, which I think is sort of like maybe a too kind of a way of expressing what was going on. Talk about Stephen Miller in the White House, what he is doing and how he has changed our immigration policy and immigration politics in many respects in this country.
Well, Stephen Miller is probably the most powerful advisor in the White House right now. He's in control not only of the immigration policy, but also Trump's rhetoric. He's one of Trump's top speechwriters and has been, from the days of the campaign. He has outlasted, many of his people like Steve Bannon and Jeff Sessions, who was his former boss when he was working in the Senate. And he's really just achieved this outsized influence. And what he's done for the most part is, he has completely transformed the immigration system where, the government is primarily targeting asylum seekers and refugees and other families who in most cases haven't broken any laws, with the exception being occasionally the misdemeanor of illegal entry. So before the Trump administration came in, there was really an emphasis on, felons, on criminals and cartels. And despite the rhetoric that you hear out of Trump, when you look at the man who is shaping his immigration policy, his focus is really on, targeting people fleeing violence and persecution, mostly from Central America, but also many countries in Africa. So we saw Stephen Miller, slash refugee admissions to new historic lows every year. We saw him completely obliterate the asylum system at the U.S.-Mexico border slowly to the point where now they're not accepting pretty much anyone. You saw him suspend green card access, really, again, targeting families. And when you look at why he's doing this, it becomes clear when you familiarize yourself with the white supremacist and white nationalist literature that he has been reading for many, many years. It becomes clear that Stephen Miller, his goal is to re-engineer the ethnic flows into this country to keep Black and brown families out. And he is focused on these areas like asylum and refugee admissions because that is where a majority of these families come in. And the other area I'll say, Stephen Miller is responsible for Trump's most incendiary rhetoric. When you hear things like far left fascism or unhinged left-wing mob, or when you hear these really gruesome descriptions of alleged migrant crimes, talking about migrants slaughtering little girls or a migrant taking a hammer to crush a woman's eye socket or something like that, that's usually Stephen Miller. I mean, Stephen Miller has a real taste for the morbid and the incendiary. And so he's responsible for a lot of that rhetoric, which you see Trump using more and more of now during this time of crisis to kind of, distract from his disastrous response to the coronavirus.
And we should say the rhetoric is in many respects doing to what happened to Miller to many other people in this country in terms of radicalizing them in this way. Let's talk a little bit. You finish towards the end of the book, you finished up with Katie McHugh. And this is how, in many respects, we know when you say he reads white nationalist literature, he reads white supremacist literature, he traffics it too, right? And so, I mean, just
exactly.
talk about that a little bit, because this is, I mean, the thing that I find fascinating about your book is that it really talks about the radicalization of a basically of a, I don't know, 13 to 16-year-old kid, boy, and it sticks essentially. And,
Exactly.
we talk about it happening to teens on this program, in many respects what we do, but this is, one, every now and then one of them ends up being the one of the most powerful people in the country. Talk about how Katie McHugh and how we know that he traffics in his stuff.
Yeah, so Katie McHugh is the writer. She used to be a writer at Breitbart, the right-wing website. And while she was a writer there, Stephen Miller was assigned to send her story pitches that she was expected to turn into articles. And you can see from emails that she shared with the Southern Poverty Law Center that for years, Stephen Miller was feeding her websites, white supremacist and white nationalist websites, and urging her to do stories about them. And she tells me that it really helped to radicalize her, in the alt-right white supremacist movement, which she eventually abandoned. But for a while, I mean, she says he was pumping her with articles about, painting Black and brown people as innately more violent than white people. So just constantly feeding her material about crimes committed by Black and brown people in a misleading way to try to create this impression in her mind that Americans face some kind of existential threat in the form of Black and brown people. And she eventually, leaves the movement, and she shares these hundreds of emails with the Southern Poverty Law Center, many of which I've seen. And you realize that he, he's very familiar and inspired by these white nationalists and white supremacist sources. And it's because, as you point out, and as I try to point out in my book, Stephen Miller himself was indoctrinated in these views at a very young age, in the same way that he indoctrinated Katie McHugh. I mean, when he was a teenager, his mentor, David Horowitz, tells me that he believes he exposed him to the website American Renaissance, which is one of these websites that he was sharing with Katie McHugh that pumps out misleading Black and brown crime statistics. And you see, and so from a very young age, I mean, Stephen Miller, he was going through a hard time in his life and feeling displaced. His family had to move from a very affluent part of Santa Monica, California, to a less affluent part because his father was struggling with his real estate company. He was tangled up in numerous legal disputes and bankruptcies related to his real estate company. And so Stephen Miller was he kind of fit the profile of someone, who would be radicalized. He was feeling lost. He was feeling displaced. He was feeling angry. And David Horowitz came in, as did other, far right radicals, came in during this period of his life and gave him a sense of purpose and a mission in life. And Horowitz, who is a former Marxist turned right-wing radical, introduced him to this fantasy that Stephen Miller had to save the United States from certain destruction in the form of the Democratic Party through its alliances with Muslims and other people who happen to always be people of color. And so Stephen Miller,
hold on. I want to just
consumed.
I want to back up. So let's go to sort of his origin story, because this is also very fascinating to me personally, just because it was I first came out to California for work from 95, and I was there through the end of the 90s, off and on, and in the first 4 or 5 years of the aughts, as it were, spending my time listening to right-wing talk radio as I was going from job to job. And so I'm very familiar with these guys that he was sort of bathing in at the time. And so just let's start with Prop 187, which happens in 94, because the other thing that I find fascinating about the story that you tell about Stephen Miller is that there is maybe a little bit of encouragement in that what California was going through from like the 90s into the first decade of the 21st century was sort of this shift that maybe the country as a whole is going through, in and of itself. And in my estimation, it works out okay in the end. But let's talk about Prop 187 and walk us through what's going on in California at that time and how he ends up finding David Horowitz, because there's an interim step, right? But talk about 187.
Exactly. Yes. So exactly. I mean, Prop 187 is just one of many anti-immigrant measures that were taken in California at the time. And, I really see Stephen Miller as being a product of this environment in which California was seeing unprecedented anti-immigrant hostility, and was sort of a microcosm, as you point out, for what we're seeing nationally today. I mean, the Prop 187, Republicans and Democrats came together to, attack social services for undocumented migrants, including access to public schools for their children. This is something that was eventually found unconstitutional, because for a variety of reasons, one of which is the fact that, the children should not be punished for the crimes of their parents, and also just the fact that if you deprive children of access to public education, then, you foreclose any possibility that they might contribute in a positive way to our society. And so it's, bad for everybody. So there was Prop 187. There were also statewide attacks on bilingual education. There were statewide attacks on affirmative action. There were statewide attacks on the Spanish language, and trying to make English the official language of California. And this was, you saw this across the state, and it was in part, Republican Governor Pete Wilson of California at the time. He was blaming all of the state's fiscal problems on migrants, and, talking about the invasion at the border, and running advertisements on television showing, families running across the border, and with his ominous narration talking about how they keep coming. And so Stephen Miller, he was listening to this, and he begins to internalize a lot of this rhetoric. And I remember, because I grew up in Southern California at the same time as Stephen Miller. I'm just a couple years younger, and grew up a couple hours south of him in Santa Monica. And I remember, as the daughter of a Mexican immigrant and a Puerto Rican mother, I internalized this rhetoric as well. I remember there was a sense of shame associated with being Mexican, and people wanted to hide the fact that they were Mexican. And so to me, it's not really surprising at all that a young Stephen Miller internalized this, and began to express, racist viewpoints at a very young age. The difference is that Stephen Miller sounds the same today as he did when he was 16. But you see him at school, breaking up with a Mexican friend because of his Latino heritage, telling him he can't be friends with someone who's Latino.
I found that striking. It was a guy named Jason Isles, and it's his buddy, and he's going to high school, and it's sort of like, I don't know. I feel like you could see this scene in a movie where it's like, the social climbing kid says to his friends, like, you guys in the chess club or whatever it is, you guys are nerds, and I'm not hanging out with you anymore because I'm going to try and be, a big man on campus or whatever it is. Except for in this instance, he's saying it because of his Mexican heritage.
Exactly. They were friends. They used to talk on the phone frequently about, Star Trek, and they used to have lunch together and things like that. And then, after a while, Stephen just kind of stopped calling and stopped returning his calls. And then one day he did call Jason Islas up and said, I just can't be friends with you anymore because of your Latino heritage. And that this is just, one of the first instances that we see Stephen Miller beginning to really internalize this anti-immigrant, anti-Latino rhetoric. And it's partly, he was listening to Rush Limbaugh at the time. He was listening to this conservative talk show host named Larry Elder.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a second. Let me just ask you, because Larry Elder is a fascinating figure in my estimation. But do you think, because obviously his dad's going through some legal issues. We don't really know for sure, what the dynamic is going on in the home, right? But his parents were also, his relationship to immigrants and immigrancy, I guess. Like, to what extent do you have is it in your feeling, did he have that sort of same dynamic that you talk about with your mom, where they where he wanted to make sure that he was perceived as American, then on some level, like, he had to go, like, if you in the wake of 9/11, every cab that you would get into that was driven by anyone of, like, whether they were from Pakistan, whether they were Sikh, just anybody who was not lily white, would put an American flag on there to sort of, because they felt like they had to sort of, protect themselves from what was happening in terms of, like, some of this backlash. On some level, like, psychologically, do you think that Miller was, felt like, I need to show my bona fides? I mean, did he have any, like, my bona fides that I'm so American that I'm going to, get as far away from my own personal, I guess, background as possible?
Yeah, from my conversations with people who knew him back then for the book, it's clear that he did, want to showcase an unusual amount of patriotism around this time. I mean, he writes about having visited Mexico and being very pleased with the fact that they listened to American music and wore American looking clothing, and he talks about, I mean, he doesn't renounce his Jewishness, but he talks about how how Jewish holidays are important to him, but more important to him are American holidays, because he says Jewish people are a minority, so Americanness is more important to me. So he really starts to identify with being American, and but for him, that manifests as identifying with whiteness, and I really do believe that he was internalizing that sense of shame with being other, having descended from Jewish refugees, and wanted to be seen as American with all of the privileges that is supposed to guarantee. And I remember this feeling myself, and so I can empathize with what Stephen Miller was going through at the time. But you saw him taking it to a whole other level. After the 9/11 attacks, he became very upset with the fact that his high school was not, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. He really wanted to show his patriotism by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. And this is when you see him, call into the Larry Elder show.
Now, Larry Elder, for people who don't know, is a black conservative who I think is on after, if I'm not mistaken, I think he's on after Sean Hannity out there. And I should just say, because it makes this even more disturbing on some level, I sat down with Larry Elder in the 2004 Democratic National Convention with Janine Garofalo, and I were going around and talking to right-wing talk radio hosts as we were there for Air America. Larry Elder sat there, and Janine and I were a little bit contentious with this guy. And I certainly had been listening to him over the course of, like, 4 or 5, maybe 10 years prior to that. And we were a little contentious, and he's like, come on, guys, let's leave it on the field. And we just looked at him like, are you serious? And the idea that he had this type of impact, which I didn't know, obviously, on Stephen Miller, like his play acting, to a certain extent, I know that he has some beliefs, but his play acting, that it was just sort of like, part of the job, and let's take the uniforms off, when he is leading ultimately to, what we've seen with immigrants, is just sort of like, I don't know, it makes me nauseous on some level. But so he starts listening to Larry Elder, calls in enough that he becomes sort of like Larry Elder. Larry Elder's like, oh, I've got a 16-year-old who really sounds like a full-on, fascist in the making. I'm going to promote this guy, basically.
Yeah, I mean, Larry Elder tells me he was very impressed with how articulate Stephen Miller was for a teenager, and that he ultimately invited him onto the show a total of 69 times. And, he was telling me about how impressed he was with, just the way that Stephen Miller spoke, the way that Stephen Miller dressed, and he clearly had a huge impact on Stephen Miller, not only because he gave him a platform through which his voice was heard by a number of other leading conservative figures in Los Angeles at the time, such as, Steve Bannon and David Horowitz, but also, he wrote this book called 10 Things You Can't Say in America, which Stephen Miller read as a teenager and later cited it as one of his most formative books. And one of the things the book talks about is how, according to Larry Elder, systemic racism and institutional racism are fictions, at least when they come to people of color. The only real racism, according to Larry Elder, is, anti-white racism, that Black people are more racist than white people. And this idea really spoke to Stephen Miller and to many other people, who couldn't believe that there was, a Black man kind of providing them a framework to justify their racist beliefs. I mean, Larry Elder says that the problems of the Black community are a result of a problem of self-determination within the Black community, and not institutional or systemic issues. And as you might guess, I mean, these ideas are very popular among white conservatives who have racist beliefs about the Black and brown communities. And yeah, so Stephen Miller is on his show. He's complaining about his school's alleged lack of patriotism. He actually gets his school to start reciting the pledge because he shamed them on the Larry Elder show. And this gives Stephen a sense of power.
Right.
You see him from a very early age having an impact through the media, forcing institutions, in this case his school administration, to do things that he wanted them to do.
It is so sweet, this story of two people filled with self-loathing who come to find in each other a deep down friendship. So touching on some level. And this is where David Horowitz, who was, I think at this time, doing his college tour, claiming that we're now talking basically 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, like around then, right? Where Horowitz is going around claiming that and keeping the names of professors who are saying left-wing things in college, tracking them, has basically a clearinghouse think tank. I don't know if it was him and just a secretary or what, but they were really on the whole campus PC culture, right, at the time?
Exactly. Yeah. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, David Horowitz was leading a campaign to defend white conservative college men who were in trouble due to allegations of racism or xenophobia or sexism. And really, characterizing these men as victims of discrimination based on their skin color. So completely inverting, the arguments of the civil rights movement and the arguments that are usually used by the left. He successfully, I mean, there was this one college in Cal State Northridge that a fraternity had been suspended because they had passed out flyers with referencing a very racist song about, a Mexican girl who's penetrated, just a terrible, disgusting song. And David Horowitz got some attorneys to put legal pressure on the school and reinstate the fraternity. So just that kind of thing. And he when he heard Stephen Miller on the radio, he saw, a kindred spirit, a gutsy. He told me he saw him as very gutsy and a potential recruit to his movement. And so coincidentally, as Horowitz is thinking this, Stephen Miller actually reaches out to David Horowitz because he heard about him through a conservative classmate. And Stephen Miller was always, as you can see, very, very skilled at networking. And so he reaches out, he invites him to speak at his high school. David Horowitz comes, he takes a real liking to Stephen Miller. He begins to, invite him over to his house and, have conversations with him. And ultimately, completely sets him up career-wise. Gets him his first jobs in Congress. Recruits him to lead this thing called the Terrorism Awareness Project that essentially just conflates all Muslims and all Arabs with terrorists. And even according to private correspondence that I obtained for the book, he was shaping Trump's rhetoric and Trump's policies through Stephen Miller throughout the campaign and possibly during his time in the administration as well. So this is a man, David Horowitz, like Larry Elder, he believes that anti-white racism is the only important racism, that, any claims of racism against minority communities are a figment of your imagination. And he introduced Stephen Miller also to this idea that, everything that we hold dear as Americans, things like liberty and equality, are a product of white men, which is ahistorical, obviously, because it ignores the central role of people of color throughout American history. But Stephen Miller was taken with this idea and began to believe that to be a patriot meant to, preserve the whiteness of this country.
I want people to really just focus in on this sort of the Horowitz thing is so important, because when Horowitz in the aughts, his whole project, I think, culminated in a book, and maybe it was like 2005 or somewhere around then, about that literally was a list of professors in universities that he felt were too left-wing, liberal maybe at the time is what he would say. And so the idea was like, there was too much PC happening. This is what the words they would use at the time. There was too much PC, all of which was the sort of public face of the white supremacy argument that they're making. And it has evolved. They now talk about it as cancel culture is the problem. And a guy who literally wrote a book saying, here's a list of professors who should be canceled at these universities. The only difference here is like sort of like just what the relative power dynamic is. The idea has been consistent throughout. It's just that it gets regurgitated and resold to the American public in different ways. And Stephen Miller was intricately involved in that. So talk about so you've got this alliance between, basically Horowitz becomes Miller's mentor in many respects. Larry Elder is sort of like the, the midwife of the mentoring. Where does Steve Bannon come in? I mean, what, and not just Breitbart, the organization, was there ever a relationship between Breitbart and Miller?
Yes.
Because they were cut from the very similar cloth, I think.
Yes. Yeah. So, and I just want to say quickly to your argument about, Horowitz sort of having this double standard about cancellation. He told me that he was sharing his emails with me because he read an interview that I gave about how opposed I am to the concept of labeling people and reducing people to labels and putting them into boxes. And he said that made him trust that I would never dare to call him a hate monger, call Stephen Miller a hate monger, because he saw me as a reasonable person who never labels people, which is, it was just so strange, because all that David Horowitz does is label people and put people in boxes, call Democrats totalitarians, call Black Lives Matter a Nazi organization and terrorists. This is what he does. So it's just, these inversion arguments are really fascinating when you think about the deliberate psychological manipulation that's going on there.
Wait, let me ask you one more question about that. Do you think that he was sincere in that belief about you? He was wrong, I should say, apparently. But do you think that was it? Or do you think that he wants some credit?
Oh, I think that he wants credit. I would like to believe that it was some sincere belief of his, and I really don't know. But to me, I suspect that David Horowitz, he's approaching the end of his life, and he wants to be included in the record. And Steve Bannon has been so skilled at self-mythologizing and sort of exaggerating his role in the rise of Trump for so long, and David Horowitz has kind of lurked in the background, as has Stephen Miller. And this is part of why Stephen Miller has lasted so long in the White House, because he doesn't try to take credit for too much or even anything at all. But yeah, I mean, I suspect that David Horowitz was trying to correct the record there.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Now, all right. So let's talk Bannon. Let's talk about Breitbart, not just the publication, but the guy.
Yeah, so Steve Bannon, he's called himself a Leninist before. He talks about how he wants to tear everything down. He was at the helm of Breitbart, this right-wing website, when Stephen Miller was working in Congress in the jobs that David Horowitz had gotten him. And at the time, Stephen Miller was kind of struggling to, get stories planted in the media. He would call up reporters at the Hill and, normal traditional publications, and they would just kind of roll their eyes at him. I mean, Stephen Miller was trying to, derail the nomination of Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, saying that her Latin American heritage made her incapable of objectivity, and people just ignored him. But
now he was with Sessions at that point, right?
Yes, he was working with Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions as his first as his press secretary, and then as his communications director.
We should say prior to that, he worked for Bachman and for what's his face, the super conservative. I can't remember his name now, but he worked for Bachman.
Oh, John
and
Shadegg.
Then Shadegg. Yeah,
John Shadegg of Arizona.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and prior to that was with Michelle Bachmann. But he spends the majority of his time with Senator Jeff Sessions, and this is when he meets Steve Bannon, who remembers hearing his voice on the Larry Elder Show back in Los Angeles, and being really impressed with him, as so many people, so many conservatives listening were, and so he decides that he's going to give Stephen Miller, he and others at Breitbart decide to give Stephen Miller kind of free reign over the writers at Breitbart. And they tell the writers to take his story pitches very seriously and to, turn them into articles. And so you see Stephen Miller, this is when you see him feeding white nationalist and white supremacist literature. In particular, one that I found pretty illuminating is he tells them to write a story about parallels between real life and this book called The Camp of the Saints, which is a white supremacist, really horrific book about the destruction of the white world by brown refugees who are described in really degrading language, talked about as beasts and monsters and, sent as teeming ants toiling for the white man's comfort. And they're just depicted as incompatible with civilization and destroying Western civilization.
This was written by a far-right wing French author in like the early 70s, I think it was.
That's right. And it was translated to English in the United States by a man named John Tanton, who's a eugenicist who believed in population control for non-white people and believed in the genetic superiority of whites. So Stephen Miller reads this book. He loves it. He's inspired by it. He decides to get Breitbart to write an article about it, and they do. They paint the book as prophetic, saying that the immigration crisis at the border is going to lead to the destruction of civilization as we know it in the United States if we don't do something about it. And you also see Stephen Miller at this time derailing this historic bipartisan immigration compromise between four Democrats and four Republicans who are trying to further militarize the border, but also provide a legal pathway for people already in the country illegally. And Stephen Miller completely derails the bill, smearing it through Breitbart as something that's going to decimate America, that the globalist elites are supporting because they want limitless cheap labor in the form of mass migration, completely, smearing and misleading information about the bill. Because, as if you're trying to legitimize the workforce, you end up having to pay these people a more fair wage and there's less exploitation. But anyway, Stephen Miller succeeds in this, and this is one of his big wins. And this is around the time that the Republican Party was really moving towards being more inclusive and more diverse. They lost in 2012, and they decided in their autopsy report that they were going to make a more concerted effort to appeal to minority communities, a real reckoning. And Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon have this meeting with Jeff Sessions, and where they talk about doing the opposite. They look at this analysis that shows that there was a missing white voter in the 2012 election, and they decide that they're going to make every effort possible to transform the Republican Party, not in a more inclusive and more diverse direction, but rather doubling and tripling down on this idea of appealing to the white working class specifically. And Horowitz also sends a strategy paper around this time telling him to make the Republican Party around demonization and inciting fear and other base emotions. So Stephen Miller runs with this, and then you see, Donald Trump announcing his candidacy, and Stephen Miller gets really excited. He thinks that this is the person who's going to be able to realize all of his dreams, and he starts to provide free labor for Trump, and eventually gets himself hired officially as senior policy advisor and top speechwriter.
I mean, in many respects, this feels like, you've written it's almost the secret history of how white nationalism got into the White House, because Stephen Miller has been maybe not, well, I mean, there's nobody been more durable and resilient in the Trump White House than Stephen Miller, right? There may be some that are equally, but I guess Trump's family members. But it seems to me like Stephen Miller has somehow managed to stay within favor with Donald Trump this entire time and continue to be sort of right there always, sort of almost like Trump always returns to Stephen Miller. It seems to me. Regardless of where, there are times his eyes wander to something that might be appealing to, non-racists, but ultimately always returns to Stephen Miller. Why is that?
Yeah, he is the only person outside of the president's family who's been able to stick around from the very beginning and not piss off Donald Trump. And part of that has roots in his childhood, which I delve into in the book, and I've spoken to you a little bit about. His father Stephen Miller's father is described to me as being very Trump-like, in terms of his business dealings, plagued by bankruptcies and lawsuits, but also in terms of just being very combative. I've found some court documents that describe him as a masterpiece of evasion and manipulation. Stephen Miller grew up in a family that was very similar to the family of Donald Trump. There's some really striking parallels when you look at, Mary Trump's book and the fights over the family inheritance and people getting pushed out and stabbed in the back. There was, a lot of allegations of that in the Stephen Miller family as well. So part of it is that Stephen Miller gets Donald Trump. He gets him, he gets him psychologically, he gets him emotionally, he gets him on a spiritual level. He shares the same values. And the other key thing about Stephen Miller is, well, there's two key things. I mean, one is he's comfortable in Trump's shadow. He never gets out ahead of him. He unlike Steve Bannon, who likes to talk about himself to journalists, Stephen Miller likes to downplay his role. So it works for Trump and Trump's ego. I mean, Stephen Miller's always describing himself as a mere devoted vehicle for Trump's agenda and downplaying his role, even though he's really the architect of the immigration policy. Donald Trump did not have any real immigration policy plans until Stephen Miller came onto the campaign and started pulling policies directly from think tanks created, by eugenicists who believe in population control. So there's that. And then there's also Stephen Miller consistently pushes Trump in the most aggressive direction in terms of his rhetoric and in terms of his policies. He never questions him. He never encourages him to calm down or take a middle road. And Trump has found that whenever he listens to somebody who is trying to take him on a more moderate path, he ends up getting ridiculed by his base as weak. And Trump hates that. Trump wants to be seen as a killer. Trump has repeatedly talked about wanting to be seen as a killer and how important it is to be a killer in society. And Stephen Miller shares, his instincts for violence. He's talked about, Stephen Miller from a very young age has talked about, fantasizing about ripping apart people with his rapists with his bare hands and wanting to watch Osama bin Laden having his body riddled with bullets. They have the same sort of fascination with violence and aggressiveness. And Stephen Miller has his hands on the pulse of Trump's most violent voting base because he has been reading white supremacist and neo-Nazi literature for such a long time. So Trump believes that Miller is critical for his reelection abilities, for his reelection prospects. He believes that Stephen Miller is the reason that he won in 2016 because of the rhetoric and the immigration policies that he brought to the table. And he believes that he needs to, rely on Stephen Miller if he wants to win in November.
We should also say that Stephen Miller had a relationship with Richard Spencer, which he now denies he had any relationship with. I'm curious, as you talk about like sort of their personal connection on some level, that Miller grew up in sort of a similar household. It also strikes me like Jared Kushner is sort of like a slight, like, I don't know, like there's like a Cain and Abel quality to them, right? I mean, they're similar in age. Kushner grew up in a household that I think was probably not terribly dissimilar from Trump's. So he had a very wealthy father who was willing to literally throw his brother under the bus to avoid, that ended up getting him in prison himself. Is there any, what's their relation? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, so again, Stephen Miller's very good at managing relationships and at networking. And so he identified early on in the White House that even though he didn't agree ideologically with Kushner on many things, primarily the immigration issue. I mean, Kushner's more of a moderate on immigration. He knew that he had to manage that relationship and really, have a positive relationship with Kushner and Ivanka if he was going to want to stay in the White House. So, I mean, my sense of the relationship is that, he cedes control to Kushner whenever he sees it as being absolutely necessary. And this has actually had, the results of getting Stephen Miller some hostility from the far, his allies, in the restrictionist movement, because they believe that, he's ceded too much control to Jared Kushner as far as, allowing many work visas to remain in place, allowing merit-based immigration. These restrictionists want zero immigration. And Stephen Miller, also wants zero immigration. And the reason we don't is because Stephen Miller has understood that he needs to manage his relationships in a calculated and strategic way in order to stay in the White House.
What's your sense of Stephen Miller's relationship with a guy like Tucker Carlson?
They have a good relationship. I mean, Stephen Miller, I believe, went to, organized a meeting between Sessions back when he was working for Sessions and Tucker Carlson. Stephen Miller has developed, close relationships with numerous combative right-wing media personalities like Tucker Carlson, like Rush Limbaugh, like Ann Coulter, and he has brought their language, their very, fighting war type language into the White House, and he brought it to Capitol Hill too. I mean, people told me, Senate aides and others who I interviewed for the book tell me that the discourse on Capitol Hill was a lot more civilized, even among people who disagreed with each other, up until Stephen Miller came in and really started to transform the way that that immigration in particular was talked about, and to start using terms like, decimation and destruction and like immigration, the immigration posed some kind of existential threat to America. And this comes, partly from the white supremacist conspiracy theory of white genocide, which motivates so much white terrorism, like the massacre that we saw in El Paso last summer. But also it comes from, the right-wing media provocateurs like Tucker Carlson and Ann Coulter, who he has developed close relationships with and who regurgitate his talking points and whose talking points he regurgitates in the White House, and, who invite him onto their shows. I mean, Stephen Miller very recently, after being officially identified as an extremist by the Southern Poverty Law Center, was allowed to come talk to Tucker Carlson about how the presence of federal forces in Democrat-run cities, in response to anti-racist protests, is about saving the United States. So, just that melodramatic language that he gets from having listened to them, people like them, since he was a teenager.
This is fascinating stuff. All right, I got one last question for you. The spray on hair,
Sure.
the spray on hair incident. Can you tell us anything about
You're not
that?
the first person.
Can you tell us any insight? Do you have any insight into that? Like what?
Yeah.
Like did Donald Trump say
I
like
do actually.
you're a little shiny on top, and he just took it and he just ran with it, or what? What happened?
Well, I hear that it was his girlfriend, who is now his wife, who suggested that he put it on. And my my main insight into that is that one of his closest friends, who's been his friend since high school, has been able to justify everything that Stephen Miller has done, including immigration, everything he did with respect to immigration. But the one thing that he cannot justify or explain to himself is how his friend Stephen Miller thought that it was okay to go on national television with the spray paint on his head. But
from my vantage
I don't
point,
have any insights.
From my vantage point, that was the best thing that Stephen Miller did in his entire career. Gene Guerrero, the book is Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. We'll put a link to that book. It's a fascinating story. It's so important to understand what has been going on in this country, not just in terms of what we see coming out of the White House, but the idea of radicalization, the impact of right-wing talkers and these fake think tanks that they develop. And I think also, to understand when people start talking about cancel culture, where this whole idea emanates from. I really appreciate your coming on.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.